Our speaker tonight, Brian Mcfadden, was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland in 1941. He emigrated to Canada in 1965 and worked in the printing and telecommunications industry before retiring to Nanaimo in 1996. Brian is also a former British Royal Naval Reserve member who now volunteers most of his time with programs that honor veterans and contribute to their remembrance. He is Vice President and Communications Director for the Vancouver Island Military Museum, which he joined in 1998 as a volunteer when the museum was located in the former Rutherford Mall, now known as Nanaimo North Town Centre. He became Vice President of the Vancouver Island Military Museum in 2005, seeing the museum through its restructuring and relocation to the former Nanaimo Museum building. Brian's service includes promotion of the museum, conducting tours to educate and enlighten visitors, while taking care to provide extra insight and detail on individual Canadian Armed Forces member profiles, often overlooked by the broader scope of military chronicles. The Vancouver Island Military Museum is a non-profit society established in 1986 and is staffed by mostly veteran volunteers and individuals with an interest and knowledge of military history. With that, thanks, Brian.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you this evening.
Do you need the mic?
No, I'm already mic'd. Oh yeah, we're high tech here. The talk tonight is on the Dambusters, of course, and the Nanaimo connection. 78 years ago, on the night of May the 16th, 1943, 19 bombers took off from the RAF base at Scranton in Lincolnshire, England, and they flew into legend. Protruding from the bomb bays of each aircraft was a new weapon, the likes of which had never been seen before and would be used just this one night in anger. A little over 8 hours after takeoff, the last of the bombers would touch down again on Lincolnshire soil. But now there were only 8 of them. However, in those few short hours, 53 airmen had lost their lives and a further 3 were missing. By the evening, the survivors were national heroes and a new name was born, the Dambusters. The breaching of the mighty Ruhr dams had caught the imagination of the entire free world and engraved itself in the annals of military history, one in which Canadians played a pivotal role. The air crews in those bombers were airmen from Britain, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. It also included one American serving with the RCAF. The entire episode itself has been described by the head of Bomber Command, Sir Arthur Harris, as madness born of desperation. I think you'll see why that's an accurate statement. Perhaps it's because this raid was unlike anything seen before that it captured the imagination of the public, weary after 4 years of war. The audacity of the attack is often remembered more than any other operation by Bomber Command, even those which were more successful and arguably did more for the Allied war effort. The raid on the dams was about denying the enemy its source of hydroelectric power for the manufacture of war material in the coal mines, smelters, railways and canal works that transported the raw material which fed the Nazi war machine. What made the Dambusters raid so unique and memorable, from its conception to the development of an unusual weapon and the formation of a special squadron, is the Nanaimo connection and the story of John Fraser and the part he played in Operation Chastise, the code name for the attack on the Ruhr dams. Who was John Fraser, and what was so important about these dams that garnered so much attention? Okay, first one. The dams and the cause and effect of the dams. This was a target that was known to the Air Ministry in 1937, long before the beginning of the Second World War, because most people knew that war with Nazi Germany was inevitable. The 3 massive dams in the Ruhr Valley provided 75% of the hydroelectric power that powered all of the coal mines and smelters. There were 3 major dams. One was the Mcfadden Dam, which was the largest in Europe. The second was the Eder Dam, and the third was the Sarvy Dam. The Mcfadden Dam was built in 1912, the Eder Dam in 1922, and they were built of a certain type of construction called a gravity dam, which was a huge masonry construction with water on one side, air on the other, and the water side was flat. A clay embankment was part of the bottom of that. The Sarvy Dam was built in 1933 and was constructed entirely differently. This was called an earthen dam. It had stone and earth on one side of the reinforced concrete, and on the air side of the dam was simply earth. So looking at these two dams, the Air Minister and the RAF tried to figure out a way to bomb these dams. A man called Barnes Wallis, who was a very well-respected aeronautical engineer and inventor who worked almost exclusively on explosives and bombs, his idea was to drop a 40-ton bomb from 35,000 feet. It wouldn't matter if it hit the dam, because when it penetrated the ground, the earth would shake so much that the dams would crumble. The problem was, in 1941, there wasn't an aircraft that could carry a bomb that big. So he had to come up with another idea, and he began to experiment with different methods of breaching that dam. Next slide. That's the one. That's good enough. He took his ideas to the Air Ministry and to the RAF and was laughed at them when he said that if he could place an explosive against the surface of the dam, he might be able to damage it. They allowed him a dam in Wales which was disused at a river, plus a tank, water tank, at one of the RAF's test facilities. And he began to experiment with the amount of explosives. And he found that if he put explosives in front of the dam by 10 or 15 feet, didn't matter how much explosives he put on, it wouldn't damage the dam. But when a small amount of explosive, down as low as 250 pounds of explosive, attached to the dam, he blew a 50-foot hole in the dam. So now he had to come up with a method of placing a bomb against the dam. We keep talking about this as a bomb. It's not really a bomb, it was a mine. It was called the bouncing bomb. Barnes Wallis never said that he invented this method. In fact, he took it from Admiral Lord Nelson. The Navy was doing this in the 16th and 17th centuries, when the Navy discovered that as their ships rolled in the ocean, if they angled the cannon, when it fired the cannonball, if they angled it at the right angle, it would skip across the water, which would increase the range. And so he figured, okay, if I could do that, then perhaps I could place a bomb against the surface of the dam. He persuaded the Air Force to loan him some Wellington bombers, and he began at a place called Chesil Beach in Dorset. The bomber would fly along, drop the bomb. For the first months, it exploded when it hit the water, because he was trying to figure out how high he would go. It took him all of 1941 and almost to the end of 1942 before he finally had success. Next slide. How do you drop this bomb? And who's going to do that? The Air Force at that time had thousands of pilots. But the RAF decided that we needed some special pilots, people who could fly at low level and at night. They chose this man here, Wing Commander Guy Gibson. Gibson was a very experienced pilot, even though he looks very young there. A tour of operation by Bomber Command was 30 bombing missions. By the time he was appointed to lead this special squadron, he had flown close to 100 operational missions. This is the crew that Gibson chose. He was allowed to choose not only the airmen that were necessary to do this job, but all of the pilots. Now, he couldn't possibly speak to 133 men, which was the number of men that were in the squadron. But he did know the pilots, and they had their crews. He chose his own crew. It's a 7-man crew for the bombers. By 1942, the RAF now were employing Lancaster bombers, and Lancaster bombers could fly at 25,000 feet, and they could carry a 10,000-pound bomb, which is exactly what Barnes Wallis wanted. So Gibson chose the crews, and he told them, we want low flying at 150 feet and at night. Now, the problem with flying at night at 150 feet, there was no such thing as an altimeter that could gauge 150 feet above the water. So the only way to do that was to place a light on the aircraft on one wing and in the fuselage, and shine the lights down on the water. You've all been to a theatre many times, I'm sure. When the spotlights shine on the performer on the stage, and it comes into a cone. Well, the Air Force figured out that if we calibrate the lights and shine them on the water and keep lowering the aircraft, when the cones meet in the middle, they'll be at 150 feet. And that worked. When the head of the Air Force heard about this, he said, "These people should be locked up. This is madness. We're going to fly into enemy territory against a target that is protected, and you're going to turn on the lights." There was no other way to do it. And so this is what they practiced. They also practiced flying over water at 150 feet. They used many of the dams in Wales and in the Peak District in central England. This is when the idea came of, what are we doing here? When Gibson was appointed, all he was told by Barnes-Wallis was, "I want you to fly at 150 feet at night." That's it. Didn't tell him what the target was, told him very little information about the target, which of course is what he told the crews. You can't tell 133 men and keep them training for the full month of April in 1943 without somebody asking the question, what are we going to do here? The Air Force themselves started a rumor which said it's the Tirpitz we're going to bomb. Now that made sense to many of the crews. The Tirpitz was one of the largest battleships in Hitler's fleet, and it was hidden in a fjord in Norway. And so it made sense when you thought about it. The Air Force had tried to sink the Tirpitz years before in their usual method of bombing from 10,000 feet. They damaged it, but not to any great extent. The Navy had tried to sink it by sneaking in midget submarines and laying mines underneath it. They damaged some plates, but the Tirpitz was still in operation. And of course the Navy and Churchill was desperate to sink that battleship so it wouldn't get out into the ocean and behave just like the Bismarck. And so the crews were told that's what the target is. And so they practiced at the Derwent Reservoir, low-level flying and precision bombing. Out of the 133 airmen, Gibson had chosen 11 pilots from the RAF, 4 from the RCAF, 3 from the Royal Australian Air Force, and 1 from the Royal New Zealand Air Force. John Fraser was part of the crew on the second bomber, piloted by a man called John Hopgood. Now, Hopgood's crew also had 2 Canadians. One was Fraser, and another man was called Ken Earnshaw, who was the navigator, and he was from Calgary. Many of these men had joined the RCAF. More than 30% of all the Canadians that joined the Air Force in the Second World War went to serve with the RAF. And the reason for that was simply, they had more bombers, they had more squadrons. So if 50 people qualified as pilots or navigators, and the RCAF needed 5, well, the rest went to the RAF. And Bomber Command was one structure. So it was really a Commonwealth Air Force. And so Gibson's job was pick the very best pilots. He chose Hopkirk as his number 2 man, as being one of the best pilots to be able to fly at low level. And Hopgood chose, in his crew, Earnshaw and Fraser. They went through over 2,000 hours of training in April. All they knew was, we have to fly low, and we have a target that's over water, and we'll be flying at night. The date chosen, next slide. Yeah. The date chosen was the 16th and 17th of May 1943. The reason they chose that date to bomb the dams was the water would be at its highest level, and there was a moon that night. So it was essentially an excellent idea. The method they were going to use, they would fly in waves. The first wave of 9 aircraft, with Gibson leading and Hopgood as the number 2. The second wave of 5 aircraft would be piloted by Royal Canadian Air Force pilot McCarthy, with Byers, who's another Canadian. And the third wave would be 5 aircraft, which would be the reserve wave. The people that are highlighted are Canadian pilots. I don't know if any of you know how the crew of a Lancaster bomber is situated on the plane. Up front you'll see this plastic nose cone. That's where John Fraser would have done his work as a bomb aimer. Sitting above him would have been the nose gunner, with his 2 feet hanging down over the bomb aimer's shoulders. Behind in the cockpit would be the pilot and the flight engineer, who acted as a co-pilot. In the center of the aircraft would have been the wireless operator and the navigator, and in the tail of the aircraft would have been the gunner. That was the 7-man crew. You can see in the top slide here the Ruhr Valley, close to the border with Holland in western Germany. Close to the city of Munster would be the Mcfadden Dam, Cologne would be the Sarvy Dam, and down near Kassel would be the Eder Dam. They would leave in 3 waves. One wave would fly north, one wave would fly south. And the reason for that was to confuse the Germans as you flew over Holland. Holland was the most heavily defended anti-aircraft batteries in all of the coast. This is where most of the bombers would lose their lives, over that particular area. They would leave in 2 different waves, and they would meet 10 miles west of the Mcfadden Dam. There they would rendezvous, and in 5-minute intervals they would fly in to bomb the dam, just as I've shown in this illustration. They'd start the run, and at 250 miles an hour, 450 yards from the dam, they would drop the bomb, which was called the upkeep. That was the nickname of the bomb. It had to bounce over the water, over the top of the first anti-torpedo net, because the Germans knew that someone would try and burst this dam with perhaps a torpedo. So they had 2 nets, first and second. It would have to bounce over both the anti-torpedo nets, hit the dam, and roll down the dam. To accomplish that, they had to spin the bomb backwards. For anybody that's played golf, you know if you put backspin on something that it rolls backwards. If they hadn't have done that, when the bomb hit the dam, it would have bounced away. But by having backspin on it, the idea was it would crawl down the face of the dam. When it got to 30 feet, it would detonate just like a depth charge and crack the dam. That was the theory. Never been proven, never been done before, but Barnes Wallis had all of this calculation. He calculated this in a tank, firing golf balls from a catapult down the tank for years to try and perfect this. He was convinced it would work. The Mcfadden Dam particularly was 160 feet high, as much as 60 to 80 feet at the bottom. So it was quite a job to burst that kind of dam. The idea was that they'd all meet. The first wave would attack the dams in that order. The second wave would carry on to this dam, the Sarvy Dam. Now the problem with that dam was it was built differently to the other 2. You couldn't have the bomb spinning backwards, because if it rolled away from the dam, it would roll down the hill. The explosion would do nothing. So the people who were flying the second wave, they were told, don't spin it backwards, drop it on the top of the dam. The theory was, if you drop the bomb on the top of the dam, it'll take off enough concrete, enough water will wash over the top that it'll wash the mud away. So if we can do that, there's a chance that we'll be able to hit the dam. The bombs that they dropped were 9,500 pounds with 6,200 pounds of explosives. They would fly at the dam in 5-minute intervals. Now, in this crossing that they were doing into the over Holland, as I mentioned, the Luftwaffe had amazing anti-aircraft ability to shoot down enemy aircraft. They had radar guided fighters. They also had 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft shells, and they had searchlights. And with that, they had tremendous success at shooting down the bombers. As well as flying at 60 feet, when they got to the dams, before they left they were told, you've got to fly under 100 feet, because if you don't fly under 100 feet, the radar will pick you up and you'll be shot down. All of this was happening in the minds of the planners and also in the commanders. The crews were not told until 6 o'clock on the night they left what the target was and what they were expected to do. So they all met in a hangar, and Barnes-Wallis gave them their instructions. You can imagine, I'm sure, in your own mind, what it was like after you'd been practicing and practicing for a whole month, thinking that you're going to be bombing a huge battleship, and this man comes along and tells you, no, you're going to drop a bomb at the dam and it has to bounce, which you've been practicing. That's the job that you're going to be doing. So I think it was quite a shock to most of the crew. Next slide. Okay. This is the attack on the dams. At 5-minute intervals, they flew into the dams, dropped their bombs. Gibson was the first plane to attack. His bomb exploded prematurely, didn't hit the dam. The second person into the dam was Hopgood, with John Fraser in the nose of the aircraft. Do you have the... Okay, this is John Fraser. John was born in Nanaimo in 1933. He attended high school in Nanaimo, and in 1940, he graduated at 18 years of age. He wanted to go to UBC and study engineering, but by that time, of course, other events, world events, had overtaken him. When he joined the RCAF, he went to Lethbridge to be trained as a bomb aimer. This is a photograph of John at Mount Benson, sometime around 1938. The clipping from the newspaper, which shows him graduating as a flight sergeant, that's a picture of him outside his mother's house in Departure Bay, which is where he lived. Photograph on the left is John Fraser's pilot officer. By the time the dams raid came around, he had been promoted from flight sergeant to pilot officer. And this is his crew. He's the man on the extreme left on the lower row. Now there's 7 men in the crew and there's 4 extra men there. The 4 extra men are the ground crew. So that's the crew that John Fraser flew to the dams. He first went to number 50 Squadron, RAF, but when the new special squadron was formed by Gibson, it was called 617 Squadron, known ever after that as the Dambusters Squadron. So everyone was transferred to 617. So this is John's attack on the dam. And it's probably best if I read you his account of what happened here. The Moen Dam is the picture on the top, and you'll notice the tower. This is the bomb aimer's position, and what he's holding in his hand here is the aiming device. Bomb aimers normally were looking down through their sights to bomb on a target below. Everything here was thrown together rapidly over a 2 to 3 month period. This was like a large catapult held on its side, and there were 2 pins on the end. When they dropped the bomb at 450 feet away from the dam, how they estimated the 450 feet was, on the dams, these towers are equidistant from the center. So the bomb aimer was supposed to hold this in one hand, the bomb release in the other hand, and when the 2 pins lined up with the towers, that's when he would release the bomb. How anyone did this in an aircraft that bounced around all over the air is a miracle that they hit the dam. There's a picture here on the left which is a painting which shows what it was like to fly over these dams, which had 12 guns, 9 on each side and 3 on the dams, firing at them as they went along. This is the plane that John Fraser flew in. Number 2 was AJM. AJ is the squadron code. Every aircraft had the AJ on the side of it. The M is the code for the actual aircraft, and M stands for mother. This is the crew that Hopgood had. Hopgood from the RAF, Earnshaw RCAF, Mitchell, Gregory and Brennan were RAF, John was from the RCAF, and the Butcher, the tail gunner, was from the Royal Australian Air Force. This is his account of the dam. We took off at 2139 and flew to the dams at an extremely low altitude. At one point, the rear gunner, Tony Butcher, saw a looping arc of high-tension cable above his line of vision. Then it seemed to drop away behind the aircraft as the pilot gained height. "Right under the bloody thing," exclaimed Gregory, the front gunner. "Sorry about that," said the pilot. "I'm carrying on." The intercom on the aircraft They could communicate between each person, plus with VHF, other planes could hear their chatter, but they tried to keep it to a minimum. Soon after, we were raked with gunfire. Butcher was hit in the leg and the stomach, and a searchlight blazed on and caught us in the glare. Butcher shot it out. Then shells burst right alongside, and Hopgood feathered an engine which had caught fire. John Minchin, the wireless operator, had also been shot in both legs, and the front gunner, Gregory, did not respond over the intercom. He'd either been killed or seriously injured. He never reported again. Brennan, the flight engineer, suddenly shouted, "Christ, look at the blood," as he held a handkerchief to the pilot's head. Hopgood had been hit by a piece of shrapnel which pierced the cockpit window. "I'm okay," shouted Hopgood. "Carry on and don't worry." They were still an hour before they even reached the dam. We were the second aircraft to attack, Fraser recalled. Gibson attacked first and had the element of surprise. Then the guns on the towers crossed up on us, and a light flak battery came on the side. We had to fly right through the middle of it. I released a bomb just as we were hit on the starboard wing, and it caught fire. At that low altitude, the chances of bailing out were practically nothing. Fraser's pilot, Hopgood, was trying to get some altitude to at least 500 feet to allow the crew to bail out. Fraser writes, "We flew on and Hopgood gave the order to abandon the aircraft within 25 seconds of flying over the dam. I heard him yell, 'Get out, get out. I can't get any more height. If I could only get another 300 feet. He was struggling to get enough altitude so all the crew could bail out. I knelt facing forward over the escape hatch, and I saw that the trees looked awfully damn close. The only thing I could do was to pull the ripcord and push the chute through the hatch and let it pull me out. As I rolled out, the tail plane just flew by my ear. I swung to the vertical position seconds before I hit the ground. Before I touched down, I saw the plane crash in flames about 2,000 yards away. Over the radio, the other aircraft heard Gibson say, 'Poor old Hoppy.'" Gibson stayed with all of these planes as they flew in one after another. He stooged around above the fire, trying to draw the gunners' fire away from the people that were flying to hit the dam. There were 8 aircraft. The 4th aircraft hit the dam. A man called Digby Young was flying it, and it burst, and the water flowed out in a huge flow. He was heard to say over the radio, "This one's for Hoppy," because everybody could see the burning aircraft as they flew off the top of it. The Moan Dam was breached, and you could see the water flowing down. Now you can see the 2 towers on each side where the aiming point was. The Eder Dam in the middle, again, was burst. The Sarvy Dam, as I mentioned, couldn't be destroyed in the same way. And you can see distinctly here, on one side is the water side, the other side is the earth side. The 5 planes that flew on, with the 2 Canadian pilots, in that particular case, they were down to 1 aircraft. 4 of the aircraft on that second flight were gone before they even reached the dam. On the 3rd flight, which was the reserve flight, only 2 pilots were left alive. One was a man called Ken Brown, and McCarthy and Brown attacked the Sarvy Dam, and you can clearly see here where they've hit the top of the dam and the water has run down, and at the bottom you can see the mud in the river. The problem was, by this time they were out of bombs, out of aircraft, and out of time. And so all that could struggled back to Scranton. Now I should do that. Keep on going. Just want to see what. Okay. Now we're back to John. John landed in a wheat field, gathered his parachute, made his way to a hedgerow at the edge of the field, and hid the chute in a culvert. And then he concealed himself nearby, as dozens of local people from the nearby town of Ostoon came to watch the burning wreckage of the crashed bomber. Tony Butcher, the rear gunner, had the same idea as John. He opened his parachute inside the aircraft and pushed it out. As he jumped from the stricken aircraft, unfortunately, the tail plane hit him in the back and broke his back. But he landed in the same wheat field, but quite away from where John had landed. He lay there until he was picked up by the Germans and sent to a prisoner of war camp. John had his own problems, and he remained hidden, awaiting an opportunity to sneak through the cordon which German troops had set up around the wheat field. Now, he did manage to get away, and for 10 days he walked towards the Dutch border, his idea being that if I can get to the border, Holland is occupied, there may be enough people there who will hide me, and maybe I'll get back to England. He lived on carrots and turnips that he picked up in farmers' fields and drank the water from the ditch. Near the town of Weiss, on the 28th of May, he was spotted by German police and arrested. He was exhausted and dehydrated. You can see what he was like in this photograph that they took of him. This is his arrest record. You see how they spelled Canada with a K. The back of the record, it says that he was uncooperative, refused to give any information, and said he was proud of the work that he had done on the dams. When the German officers told him, "Your bomb didn't burst the dam," he said, "Well, a couple of months ago I was on a nighttime raid over Berlin, and that night I was right on the money." That earned him 12 days in solitary confinement. Eventually, John was shipped off to Stalag. He was in 4 different camps, but he was shipped off to Stalag Luft 3. This is the camp that was made famous by Hollywood in The Great Escape, where prisoners tunneled underneath the wire, excavating all the dirt. Now, John wasn't part of the escape party, but he was part of the group that helped organize getting rid of all of the dirt. He was one of what was called the penguins. Because you've got to get rid of all the soil that's excavated out of the tunnel, and if you make a big pile of it in the prison camp, the Germans are going to figure out pretty quickly what's been happening. So they filled sandbags with the dirt, hid them down the inside of their trousers with a hole in the bottom of the sandbag, and then they waddled around like penguins all over the camp, sheeting the dirt out of the bottom of the trouser leg and then scooping it with their feet into the dirt. Germans never figured out how they got rid of all of the dirt. So he ended up as one of the penguins. He was in 4 different camps. So he was there for 2 years. His wife Doris, who he married in England, didn't hear from him for 3 months. She had received a letter from Gibson to say that he was missing. And so anybody who knew what had happened on the dams raid and the casualties that they took probably thought that he was dead. While John was training in England with the squadron, he wanted to get married. He had met a girl called Doris Wilkinson from Doncaster in England. He wanted to get married. Gibson refused to give him permission to leave the base, and Hopgood intervened on John's behalf. He was allowed 1 day. So on the 29th of April, he left Scranton, got married, and came back the next day. His wife didn't see him for another 2 years. So, carry on. This is the destruction. This is a picture of a man called Albert Speer, who was Hitler's armament minister. He was sent to survey all of the damage. He's standing in front of the Moen Dam taking photographs. Hitler was absolutely furious that the RAF had managed to sneak across Holland into Germany and destroy 2 and damage the 3rd dam. The water that swept down through the Ruhr was 30 feet high and stretched for 5 miles. It swept everything in front of it. Mines were flooded. Railway cars and engines were tossed about like children's toys. The destruction was horrendous, as you can see in the top picture. This is a bomb that the Germans captured from one of the downed aircraft. And they figured out, of course, how it worked. This is a front of the Daily Mail that was printed just after, in England, just after the raid. Of course, it says that the RAF blew up the 3 key dams. Well, this is all kept under secrecy. There was not a lot of information given out about it. But that raised people's morale tremendously to know that that could have happened. As with every bombing operation, there's always casualties, not only on the people that were on the raid, but on the civilians. Probably the biggest tragedy was the Germans used slave labor or forced labor to build a lot of these dams and to work in the factories. 1,500 Polish and Russian women who had been captured were sent to work here. 500 of them died in the deluge, along with another 100 male prisoners from Holland, Belgium and France. So unfortunately, as well as all of the destruction, all of those people, innocent people who were being forced to work in the mines and work in the factories, lost their lives as well. Was it worth it? Was it worth it? It's debatable. The Germans managed to get the dams up and running again in about 6 months. However, the morale boost to the Air Force and to the people was immeasurable. Also, Stalin was happy. He was constantly beating up on Churchill to do more. And most importantly, the Americans were in doubt as to whether bombing was really going to have the effect. After that, they committed fully to the US Army Air Force's bombing. So from that standpoint, it's a two-edged sword. John walked into his mother's-in-law's house in Doncaster 2 years to the day that he left. Doris had no idea he was coming. She fainted when he walked through the door. He brought his new wife back to Canada. This is a picture taken of them in 1946. And the Daily Colonist, which is the Times Colonist today, printed that, the wedding announcement, and the story of the Dambusters raid and John Fraser. And this is a clipping from the local newspaper where he's explaining to his wife the field that he fell into and how he got away. You flip to the next slide. Sadly, tragedy followed John. When he was liberated in 1945 from the Russians, he probably never thought that he would go through anything like this again. John was always a fan of flying, and eventually he gained his pilot license in Nanaimo, and he joined the Nanaimo Flying Club, became president in 1954. He took a job with Macmillan Bladel and was the mill manager at Mayo Lumber, and he had the responsibility of log buying. And unfortunately, on the 2nd of June 1962, he left with another colleague to survey logs in Sultry Bay, close to Powell River. He crashed into the log boom. The propeller was sheared off the aircraft, plus the floats. The Transportation Safety Board brought in a verdict of inconclusive accident. The reason they said it was inconclusive was there was talk from local people that a wire had been strung across the log booms which was unmarked. And so it's believed that he caught the wire, thinking back to 2 years before, or many years before, when a high tension wire just about brought down his aircraft flying over Holland. So he lost his life in that tragic accident. John had 3 children with Doris when they lived in Nanaimo. He had moved, by the way, from Departure Bay and was out on Dooley Road in Yellow Point. And he kept the aircraft at a place called, I believe, Michael Lake. He was buried in the Cedar Memorial Gardens at Yellow Point, and when Doris bought a plot with John's name on it, she put her own name on it as well. She joined him on the 20th of April 2019. John's 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. His first son was named John after John Hopkins, who was the pilot, and Fraser always credited Hopkins for saving his life. His daughter, middle daughter, was called Cher, which was the town that Hopkins was born in, and the third son was named Guy, after Guy Gibson. And so it was certainly a sad end to a very brave man and a hero from Nanaimo. But that wasn't the end of the tragedy for the family. Do the next slide for me. A logbook such as this is priceless to any pilot or air crew. Every person carries a logbook like this. This is to write down everything that happened, when it happened. This is actually a copy of Wing Commander Guy Gibson's logbook, which copy was made by the RAF for museums and for institutions that were associated with the Royal Air Force. And so in 1996, this man, Alec Bateman, contacted Doris Fraser and asked for some memorabilia or anything that she would have that would allow him to research 617 Squadron, the Dambusters. He had also contacted several other families, and they had all sent him memorabilia, logbooks, anything they had. In 2003, Sheriff Fraser, with the picture of John, began to compile information on her father. And she wrote to Bateman and asked for the return of the logbook. A few months later, a package arrived. All that was in it was a letter and a cassette talking about the Dambusters' exploits. A slit on the bottom of the envelope, there was no logbook. Well, the family was devastated. They contacted Bateman, and he put it down to an error in the post office. They must have tampered with the package. Well, she kept pressing him on it, and eventually he said yes, the post office had admitted finding it, and it would be returned to him. For years, the family wrote to Bateman trying to recover this, as did other families. And in 2003, the Dambuster Squadron was having a reunion in England. And through the RCAF and the RAF, Cher and her mother, because of John's involvement, was invited to attend. She contacted Bateman and said, "Don't bother sending it, I'll pick it up." When she got to England, he reported that 2 days before his house had been broken into and the logbook had been stolen. Meanwhile, in the intervening years, the National Records Office in England were conducting investigations of material that had been stolen from the National Archives, and a police investigation was ensued. Eventually, they searched the house, found other memorabilia, including not the logbook, but a photo album from Ken Earnshaw's family in Calgary. It was discovered that Bateman had been taking this memorabilia, plus all of the other stuff from the National Archives, and selling them to buyers in the United States who were interested in this type of stuff. There was no way to recover it. Eventually, Bateman ended up in prison, and the judge told him, "I don't believe what you've been telling us. It's the same story all over again. What you've done is a dastardly act, and this family has been devastated by this." He was given 2 years. He was out after a year. Part of the investigation, in his defense, he produced a Christmas card which said from Cher, "By the way, you can keep the logbook." Well, it was a forgery. So that's the lengths that he went to try and hide the nefarious activities of stealing all of this material. The logbook has never been recovered and probably never will. Today, a logbook from anyone who was on that raid is worth up to $20,000. So Doris, John's wife, died, again, not knowing if the logbook was ever recovered. Cher, of course, will never give up on trying to recover the logbook, but whoever's gotten it, I'm sure in the United States, is not going to come forward now and admit to it. They've probably paid quite a bit of money for it. So it's really a sad end to a family who has gone through so much. Go to the last slide, I think. Yeah. There were 30 Canadians on the Dambusters raid. 15 came back, 15 didn't. This picture is a picture of all of the men that didn't come back. At the time when this was printed, of course, John was presumed to have died. But he's the only one, so it ended up as 14 men died and 1 as a prisoner of war. 5 of the men on the Dambusters raid were from British Columbia, from Williams Lake and New Westminster, Grand Forks. So Canada had a meager contribution. Of the 133 men that took off that night, 53 died, 3 were taken prisoner, and 80 survived the raid. By the end of 1943, 20 more of those men had died. Only 48 men survived the war. Bomber Command had the highest casualty rate of any unit, single unit, in the armed forces. The casualty rate for Bomber Command was 40%. So your chances of lasting when you joined to the end of the war was very slim. 3 of the aircraft that they'd left that night, of the 19 aircraft, didn't even cross the Dutch coast. They broke down on the way and had to leave. 5 were lost before the attack, and 3 more lost during the attack. So almost all of the ones that were lost never made it to the dams. And the reason for that was to try and fly at under 100 feet. You were a sitting duck. 2 crashed into mountains, the other crashed into an electrical pylon and exploded. 1 aircraft flew so low to the water that it tore the bomb out of the belly of the aircraft. That's one of the aircraft that had to return. So even being the experts that they were, still couldn't evade the German gunners at less than 100 feet. So that's the story, ladies and gentlemen, of the Dambusters. And the stars that you see at the top, or the asterisks, are where the planes were shot down. And you can see the number that was shot down over Holland, which is where the heaviest concentration. Most of them were shot down before they even got to the dams. That's the story of the Dambusters and the story of John Fraser and his actions that day. We like to think that one day we'll maybe be able to recover the logbook, but it's unlikely. We had an exhibit to the Dambusters in 2013, and I had the privilege of meeting Sheriff Fraser when she visited the museum in 2018 to update us with some photographs and stuff on her father. It's one of our major exhibits in Bomber Command, and we're very proud of the Canadian contribution that was made in that particular raid. Thank you for your attention. Be happy to answer any questions that you have, and hopefully you don't have any. Yeah.
How far west of the dams or upriver did they start flying at 150 feet or 100 feet?
They were flying at 150 feet as they crossed the coast of Holland. Yeah.
Okay, and I guess they had to follow the way of the river for the converging lights to.
Well, they'd
be over water all the way. So
well, that was the danger. Flying at night, they didn't turn on the lights until they got to the dam. But the noise of a Lancaster bomb, 4-engine bomber with these huge Merlin engines, I mean, it's deafening. And at 60 feet, you couldn't miss it. I mean, as soon as they dropped down to 60 feet, they alerted every German gun within 5 miles that knew something was going on. And to follow each other one after another at 5-minute intervals. It was, when you say was it worth it, half the people were lost on that raid.
So they're maintaining that altitude by dead reckoning.
That's correct, because you couldn't judge. That's why some of them ran into mountains in the dark, and one of them hit an electrical pylon and blew up. So they were going by dead reckoning is exactly right. Mm-hmm. And so even then their navigation to cross 450 miles and then rendezvous 10 miles west of the dams, where they circled anti-clockwise while Gibson got them all lined up ready to go. And they just came in one at a time, one after another. There were 9 of them hit the dam, but only 3 of the bombs burst.
I didn't catch if Fraser got to release his bomb.
He did get to release the bomb. It bounced over the dam and plowed into a power station and blew it up.
Oh, something.
But to an aircraft where half the crew were dead or wounded, with one engine on fire and not working, and the wing on fire, trying to maintain any type of altitude, it's a wonder he was able to release the bomb at all. It just cleared the dam. And that happened to a couple of the other pilots as well. Because, I mean, it sounds very easy. 450 yards from the dam that you drop it, it'll make exactly 4 bounces and get over. There's a lot of luck in there as well as talent. But all of these men, when they were chosen for this, had been close to being on their second tour. That's why they were chosen. They were all experts at low-level flying. Yeah.
Didn't one of the tails break off during the training? Like when they were doing the practicing, they dropped the bomb and the bomb bounced up and hit one of the tails?
Yes, and not on the Lancaster. That was in the earlier training when they were using a Wellington.
Oh yeah.
And that was the danger. If you fly low enough so the bomb doesn't explode or disintegrate, and that was Barnes-Wallace's problem. Every time he brought some of the Air Ministry people out to view what he was doing, you can imagine when the bomb hit and it blew up into 100 pieces. There was no explosives under it. He practiced with dummy bombs to start with, half-sized, because the aircraft, Wellington bomber couldn't carry a 10,000 pound bomb. So the ones that he was dropping at Chesil Beach were not the real thing. They didn't have a successful drop from a Lancaster until the 11th of March. It's in Gibson's logbook. I want to read you something. When you think of what these people did, this is all that Gibson says. On the 14th, full dress rehearsal at Oppingham Lake and Colchester Reservoirs, completely successful. The 16th, Lancaster, pilot, self, then he lists the crew, because normally he just wrote usual crew. Dams, led the attack on the Moan and Eder. Dams successful. That's all he wrote. After going through all that, that was all he was prepared to put in his logbook. Gibson, unfortunately, died at 26 years of age, 1944. He was so obsessed with flying with Bomber Command, he shouldn't have been flying any longer. He was a wing commander with all of those operations under his belt. He said, well, then put me in a Mosquito fighter and let me fly along with the bombers and I will spot for them. And that's what he was doing. He was shot down at 26 years of age and crashed. He lost his life in 1944, September, I believe. Tragically, it wasn't until probably 4 or 5 years ago that a story appeared which said he was shot down by friendly fire. The wife of a tail gunner on one of the Lancasters had a document signed by her husband saying it was not to be revealed until he was dead. He shot Gibson down. He mistook it for a Junkers Ju-88. And from behind, if you look at the nose, if you look at the forward, a Mosquito flying towards you with the tail fin and the two engines, a gunner who is jumping mistook Gibson's Mosquito for a German Ju-88 and fired a burst of gunfire into it, and the plane went down. That wasn't revealed until, I believe it was 2002. Up until that point, it was written up as he'd been shot down by enemy aircraft. He died over the Netherlands.
Any other question?
Yeah, was Fraser, was he the POW who wrote a journal of his time in the POW camp that CFB Comox has online?
Very likely, yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yes, and Cher wrote an article called "The Dambusters' Daughter," which is also on the internet. Yeah, it's been heartbreaking for her, following her father's story. Yeah.
And where is this Bateman scoundrel now?
That's a very good question. They say he got 2 years, but he was out after a year, so who knows? It's he's certainly probably not billing himself as a historian. He was actually a high school teacher, masquerading as a historian, and that was really to get material so he could sell it on the open market and make some money. But it took from 2003 to 2017 to get him to prison. Because when it was first reported, the police said it's a civil matter, sue him. And it wasn't until the National Archives got involved in it that they insisted that Scotland Yard charge him, get a search warrant, search his house and charge him. It's a story that we read familiar. His lawyer pleaded that he was under tremendous stress and strain. So he shouldn't be sent to prison, but the judge said, sorry.
Yes,
Great presentation. So you mentioned that the 3 dams were repaired.
Yeah,
Are they still functioning today, or they've been decommissioned?
I have no idea if they've been decommissioned, but it didn't take the Germans very long to get the dams back in operation. Look, the only thing that I guess was a plus on this, Hitler transferred 10,000 troops plus all their equipment and hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and put barrage balloons up on the dams. And Albert Speer actually said, why didn't he come back while we were fixing the dams? That was his comment on it. What he did say about the Sarvy Dam, that would have worked. In his memoirs, he said the bombing of the Sarvy would have worked. If they had enough bombs, enough water would have spilled out over and washed the dirt away. But they had them up and running fairly quickly. But one of the reasons they went for the dams and the amount of water, it takes 100 tons of water to produce 1 ton of steel. These 3 dams between them held 400 million tons of water. So you can imagine the amount of steel that would produce. And that was one of the reasons they went for the dams in the first place. But not to go back again, I think they looked at the casualty rate and thought, this is a lot. 50% of the people really didn't come home.
Did they have intel on the prison camps downriver from the dams and the potential loss of life of?
You mean the internment camps or
Yeah,
the people that were probably? But it's does the ends justify the means? I don't think it would have made any difference to them. I'm sure they knew that forced labor was building the dams, but I don't think that would have stopped them. I mean, these people were so committed to doing that. It was the cost of war, unfortunately.
Time for one more question.
Yeah.
When I saw this on TV, I dug out a picture of my dad.
Yeah.
His name is James Ward,
Uh-huh.
and he was a flight commander in the bombers in England.
Yes.
And he was in the reserve squadron that was waiting in case one of those couldn't go.
Yes.
They would have gone.
Yeah.
And he said it was really exciting.
Yeah. Well, everybody was committed to it. I mean, the high casualty rate didn't stop the people joining. I mean, they just joined in droves because everybody was set on winning the war at any cost. So when you talk about, did they consider the civilians that would have been dying? I think the sadness was that the people that died were actually prisoners, forced labor. That was the heartache, I think, of that. But, it was the cost of the war, and there were lots of other situations that were exactly the same.
I just have one more question.
Yeah.
Unpacking your chute at low altitude,
Yeah.
and was that part of the training, or was that a desperation measure in the moment?
Desperation. Well, you know that I'm sure you know how a parachute works. There's a small drogue. So when you pull the ripcord, the drogue comes out first. The wind catches the drogue and pulls the chute out. These Butcher and Fraser recognized we're so close to the ground, this will not open. The only way to do it is push the chute out. The wind caught the chute and pulled. Fraser said it was like a cork out of a bottle, just being pulled out from the. And Butcher, who was wounded in the groin and in the legs, crawling from the tail gunner position to the door of the aircraft, which is right in the center, and then tumbling out the door with his parachute. If the tail plane had hit him on the head, he'd have been dead. But it did break his back. But he recovered and ended up in the prison camp. So it was the only way to survive with bailing out at 300 feet.
Yeah.
We're going to call the questions at this point, but we're going to have coffee afterwards, and people are invited to join and talk to Brian as well if you have some more questions in the meantime.
Thank you so much for your attention on behalf of the museum.
That was a very interesting talk, really fascinating. I wish we could keep talking about it, so hang around and have some tea and cookies and
Thank you.
visit. Thanks.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Okay.